This is the famous Bealach na Bo, the pass of the cattle that separates Applecross from the rest of the Scottish Highlands. It's a wee bit windy here and there's a fair old drop. You'd think actually this is perfect for wind energy and for hydro. And it should be, but it's not. In fact, the people on Applecross, 7 in 10, live in fuel poverty. How on earth can that be? It's like a microcosm of Scotland, energy rich, but lacking the power to make it work for its people. How has it come to this? That's what this film is all about.
It is really, really, really frustrating. You know, we are, as a community, trying our hardest to respond to community needs.
So as the world shifts to electric vehicles, you'll be out of it.
We'll be out of
and
it.
Not
Yes.
thought.
Yeah.
Even though you're basically awash with energy.
Yeah. Yeah, quite a problem, isn't it?
Applecross in northwest Scotland, with the highest mountain pass in Britain and views across to Skye, Raasay and beyond, it's a fabulous place to live and awash with sources of renewable energy. The big problem, Applecross is stuck with a tiny grid connection, so small and so feeble that hardly any energy produced here can be fed into the grid to throw six, get paid and secure local jobs. And so feeble that it can't supply powerful three-phase energy, the kind needed to run a business here. It's totally maddening, but locals gamely carry on. With just 250 people, there's still plenty of human energy in Applecross, which is just as well. Because unlike remote parts of Denmark, my film they've gathered in the village hall to see, this energy-rich Scottish peninsula is struggling to attract business, export energy and stay afloat.
Denmark has plenty of islands. I'm sure many are habitable, but do they struggle like we do here? You've mentioned egg earlier. We have problems here on the mainland of trying to just get connectivity. I mean, who has the ownership of that problem?
Well, in Denmark, it's EnergyNet, a company owned by the Danish government. Yep, a grid that's publicly owned and financed, like almost every other European state. Meanwhile, back here, grid decisions for Scotland are made by the private company SSE on behalf of the Westminster government, which controls energy. A setup devised by Thatcher in the 90s, and the reason wind-rich Orkney, Shetland and the Western Isles are only getting big subsea connector cables now, 30 years on. Applecross, though, is still waiting for SSE to improve their grid. And that makes everything in life more difficult.
So we're here at the nerve centre of Apple Juice, which is community energy set up by a community company in Applecross. You work for it, Megan McInnes.
That's right.
You are a director of it, Gordon Cameron. And you are also essentially the local boy.
I'm one of the local boys, yeah. I was born and brought up here, so this is my home, and I'm very passionate about making sure we have a viable, livable, sustainable community.
Yeah. So now this wee thing behind us here is the gubbins, sorry, I'm so technical, but the kind of turbine house, is it? Just tell us what we're looking at here from that hydro.
So this is the turbine house for Apple Juice Hydro, which is a Canadian energy project. It's got the taken up at the hip of the hill, which is a tiny wee loch dam. It's about the size of the split we're talking about here. And from that we produce 90 kilowatts of renewable energy. Unfortunately, we can only export 50 kilowatts onto the grid. In 2015, we launched the community share offer. We were hoping to raise £780,000 in order to set up the project. In fact, we raised well over 800,000 in a much shorter space of time. The response was absolutely phenomenal. And everyone in the community, the local businesses, all of our networks, our peer community energy projects across the Highlands helped to support that. And then we were able to start producing energy just at the very end of 2015. And we're almost a decade now of producing energy and they're having a renewable energy source here.
We have actually the capacity in here to have another turbine, so we could be generating double what we're doing now. But unfortunately, the grid constraints and the transmission upgrades mean the requirement to transmission upgrade, we have not been able to export all that we're generating. So we've lost out on a decade of revenue. Almost 50% what we could have brought in has gone AWOL because we haven't been able to export it to the grid. So all of these community projects that we are supporting at the moment, we feel we could have done more, faster, to improve a lot of people here. So it's a big frustration. We've had promises that the required upgrades would be in place and that we would be exporting all of our energy by 2019, 2021, 2023. We believe now it's 2028. So we've got used to workarounds, we've got used to dealing with the frustrations and the disappointments, but it just means that we feel, as we're trying to move towards sustainability as a community company and as a wider community, we're being hampered by external forces.
What you currently produce, which is very small, 90 kilowatts, is, not being offensive to your lovely, perfectly formed but small, kind of exploit here. You can't even export the whole of that currently to the grid. So what are you doing with the half that you can't get into the grid?
So at the moment, as an interim measure, it's being used to heat up a polytunnel. But we've always been, since 2015, we have been trying to look at other ways of using that energy locally. We looked at a really innovative rapid EV charging battery storage projects, but we didn't raise the capital to do that. We've looked at having a private network to provide heating to the local existing resident, but that wasn't feasible because of the retrofit costs. And we're now looking at how we can connect this Applecross project to the near affordable houses we're building just behind the turbines building there as well.
But this is, on your behalf, I feel amazed, annoyed, mostly annoyed, frustrated. Obviously, you've lived here for such a long time, you kind of have had to duck and weave around all of this. But it's ridiculous.
I mean, it is really, really, really frustrating. We are, as a community, trying our hardest to respond to community needs. We set up the community company. We're trying to be self-sustaining. We have a filling station, we have an AffleNet broadband, we have apple juice. All of these things should be generating enough income for us to be self-reliable, not have to apply for external funding. But because we can only sell 55% of the energy we produce, we're having to continue to be reliant on grants.
If you were in Iceland, if you were in Norway, if you're anywhere, you would be able to use your energy locally. You would be laughing because you would actually have the cheapest bills in Europe with the level of renewables you've got around you.
From our perspective, what we would really like is for all the different bodies who are responsible to come together and work together to help fix this problem for community energy producers, rather and help us find a way of, meeting our ambitions, meeting our needs, but also helping the whole of Scotland reach the just transition and the transition to net zero. We want to be part of that, but the government's own infrastructure and private corporations' own infrastructure is preventing us from doing that.
And it seems like everything that's in your hands works.
Yeah.
Well, with great effort. Yeah. And the out of your hand stuff, it's talk to the hand.
Yeah, communities understand on the ground what the requirements are. They see the difficulties in real time and they can see what the solutions are. It's just being able to communicate all that, the energy and the drive that goes into getting these projects off the ground and try to maintain them. Getting that message to those decision makers and key stakeholders who sometimes can ease the way and move some of these roadblocks for us.
Well, that was very impressive stuff. Basically, if you're in an environment like this, and by the way, it's raining and windy, and it should be full of hydro, and they have a hydro, and they campaigned so hard to do it. It took them months to gather that money. It was an extraordinary effort way back in 2015, 2016, and they should have just been throwing six from that moment onward for this entire peninsula. This should have transformed their lives here, and because simply they cannot feed this back into the grid, it hasn't. And the admirable thing about them is it hasn't stopped them. They've got a high percentage of people who live here who are volunteering for everything, for the Coast Guard, for running the community petrol station. It's an extraordinarily active community. It makes you think that anyone who comes here is vetted for whether or not they can shin up a rope before they even get a house. So what more do they have to do? The authorities need to get their act together to match the way this community has got its act together.
It's crazy. the community can only export and get paid for half the hydro's tiny output. And I'm not kicking sand in their wee hydro's face, but it's hardly Loch Ness. Yet still too much for a totally inadequate grid. What that means is almost no chance of building a new business on the Applecross Peninsula, unless you can work around every limitation, like the redoubtable Judy Fish at the Applecross Inn, who came here in 1989.
Well, at long last, Judith Fish. Oh, I heard an awful lot about you.
Yeah, pleased to meet you. Hear you a lot on the radio.
Aye.
Thank you.
Well, the Applecross Inn.
Yeah.
You've been here for what, 37 years?
37 years now, since I was a mere child.
You're up from Yorkshire?
Yes, from Huddersfield. So, came in Friday the 13th of January 1989.
All right,
Yeah.
okay.
Memorable day.
Yeah. But, I mean, it's, you know, this inn is famous. We were here yesterday. It's absolutely packed. It's packed the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, you're struggling with some really pretty major problems on the energy front. I think your pièce de résistance is in the kitchen.
It is. Would you like to come and see the said fryer?
Let's see.
Follow me. So, as you can see, we're between the rock and the road here.
You literally are.
Literally are.
Extraordinary.
This is where our 200 plus meals a day come from. And this is the said fryer. So we had one before that fitted in perfectly. We don't have any space for going backwards and forwards. So this took an awful lot of sourcing and was quite expensive because there's no way we can have an electric fryer. It's got to be LPG.
But the problem with it is the obvious solution to have an electric one. You just
An
can't do
electric
it.
one, no. There were several electric ones that would have fitted in perfectly, but we don't have enough power in Applecross for me to do that. We've already got 3 supplies coming into the inn. We have showers. We've had to slowly take out showers to use other pieces of equipment because you can't have a 2 kilowatt shower going at the same time as other things. So continually popping and popping. So we've now got a pressurized tank with hot water.
If you went crazy, Judith, right, and you had a normal electric supply, or you were generating so much here because you had your own hydro and you were literally cooking on, well, Basque.
Yeah.
What would you do? You know, what changes could you make if you had, you know, as much electricity at a reasonable rate as you want?
I think we could be far more efficient in what we do. I mean, we already try to serve everybody. The amount of visitors coming into Applecross, we can have 500 visitors a night in Applecross. I've counted it up with the campsite, the hostel, Airbnbs, bed and breakfast. That's a lot of people looking for food. And we are efficient, but we could maybe be a little bit speedier if we had that bit more electricity.
Yeah. Well, that was a bit of a discovery. I mean, the Applecross Inn is famous. Actually, the modest Judith is an MBE. It's the centre point of this whole community, and yet they haven't even got their showers on electricity because there just isn't enough, which is extraordinary. They've got a gas fryer in there, pretty much the staple part of any hotel kitchen, and it would normally be electric, but they had to spend ages sourcing a gas one because they can't use any more electricity. And that's a problem beyond here, but for a pivot like the Applecross Inn, it's just extraordinary how they're managing to survive at all. So if you could just sort of miracle a solution to any of the problems you've got here, what would you be looking for? What would
Three phase. Yes, we've been asking for that. I mean, there's not many businesses that don't have 3-phase power. We have no 3-phase, but I can see it across the bay there.
Right. For the rest of us who don't think of phases with power, what's 3-phase?
That would give you, it gives you a lot more power. It gives you.
It's a very intense kind of power supply for big operations like this.
Operations like this, yeah.
Apple Juice could use some of their stuck hydro energy to produce 3-phase power for Judy, or keep the energy on the peninsula for a local mini-grid as they do on Egg and Knoydart, but that takes more cash. Meanwhile, many locals simply use wood for heating. Derek McLennan lives south of the inn at Toskeg, amongst endless frisky burns that could provide more community hydro if the landowner was willing and there was a decent grid. He relies on chopping and storing local wood for heating and cooking. It's a self-sufficient lifestyle he chose, but without mains gas, like most of rural Scotland, Derek would face some of the highest electricity bills in Europe if he connected, and plunged straight into fuel poverty, spending more than a tenth of his meagre income on heating. His house looks lovely, but that's because he built it himself, and his homemade wooden guitars are showstoppers. This is a man who loves wood, but none of us are getting any younger.
You're powering this baby behind me here, the AGA, on wood most of the time rather than using electricity or whatever for heating. So how does that work?
Well, ever since really we came here, we decided to opt for wood and give it a go, and we realised it was a local source of timber, and we made use of that.
Does the problem with the grid here, does that impact you at all in the your decision to transition to electricity? I mean, is it possible for you to switch into the grid or not?
It would be nice to have a smooth transition to electricity. There's not exactly a good time to do that, is it, with the rising prices and the uncertainty in fuel prices, and it just doesn't seem to be anything on the horizon that says, oh, your prices are going to go down, come down to something that's reasonable, something that you would expect in an area that is so rich in resources as Applecross.
Locals pay through the nose for the electricity they do get. 59 pence a day standing charge is far higher than central London. It's part of old thinking about the costs of supplying remote Scotland, even though these areas are now in pole position to deliver green energy.
What would you imagine would be possible if all the energy there is here in terms of all the streams, burns, the hydro, if that was all something you could capture and own and use, how do you imagine it would help life in Applecross?
I think it would make a big difference. There's a lot of people who want to set up businesses, workshops, and make a go of it here, but that is all held back.
Because of this phase 3 energy, this is a thing I've never encountered until I came here, but phase 3 energy is the really intense, powerful stuff you need for a business.
Yes.
And there is none on this peninsula.
No. Well, for example, they're on the peninsula, on the other side of the peninsula, but it's not generally thought of as Applecross. The brewery has had to site in Kishorn to access that type of electricity at phase 3. Here, no, they couldn't set up here, and this would have been the preferred site for it, somewhere.
So you've basically lost the Applecross brewery from Applecross because there's no phase 3 energy.
It's a trip over the Vialach every time for those who work there.
Because there's no phase 3 energy here.
Exactly, yeah.
And so that's what a better supply would do for here, is it would basically allow businesses and things like the brewery to site here. Do you feel frustrated about all of this, or do you just accept this situation?
I feel very frustrated about the situation, but the global, the Scottish situation with electricity, I think is just insane. The way it's been corporatized, and and they say, oh no, there's nothing we can do about it, our hands are tied or whatever. They said, oh, it doesn't work like that, and we get some weird, long-winded explanation for something that doesn't make any sense, and it still doesn't really make any sense,
Well, again, that must be maddening. I mean, it's impressive that Derek has managed to live his whole life essentially on wood. He's making beautiful guitars out of it, but principally he's using it for heat in that AGA. And, as we all get older, the prospect of having to drag yourself out in weather like this to go and collect wood, dry it, sort it, cut it, axe it, keep the cycle going and going and going. Is that what we're saying people should be doing? In a peninsula like this, which has got hydroelectricity dripping from every corner, which cannot be harnessed, once again, because there is no proper grid. This is just ridiculous.
But at least Derek has electricity for lights, if not currently heating. Nigel Thomas has neither. He lives on the other side of the mighty Bialach, in a maddening gap between two electricity grids. He has nothing but his own incredible ingenuity as an experienced engineer.
I've got to say, anyone looking at this is going to think this is not a guy who's got a problem with energy. this looks beautiful, your house. It's actually really warm. I'm saying this is the warmest we've been since we came to the peninsula. But you're actually off-grid.
Mm.
How's that then?
In this 6-mile gap, there's 10 dwellings. Most of them are holiday homes, but there's a number of us who live here permanently. There's 2 fish farms and a mobile phone mast, and everybody's on generators. Our primary source is a big diesel generator, a 55 kilowatt machine. It's like a big truck engine. It's a huge thing about the size of a small car, but it does power 3 houses. It's difficult. It's certainly expensive when you start buying generators and large batteries, and you're trying to do it on a scale that works well. So we're not frugal. We're not thinking, if I want that on, I must turn that off. I visited some houses around here that were off grid who had that. Don't put the kettle and the toaster on at the same time because that will start the generator. I tried to design that out of it, but it's a lot of effort. You've got to know what you're doing to actually come up with a system, but it's almost an industrial size solution.
But that's because you're an engineer.
Yes.
Right. Which is a not small point in this, really.
That's true. That's absolutely true. Yes, there is that. If I weren't, it would be very hard. I know people here in the Balgi Gap who aren't engineers, but they do rely on a lot of help to keep them going, keep the generators going.
This gap. What's the name?
The Balgi Gap. It's historically known as, so between Shieldaig, 3 miles that way, and Torridon, 3 miles that way, there was historically no road here, but there was plenty of people living along here, and they built the road in 1963 to what they called to bridge the gap. So if you could go from Torridon or Elgin to Shieldaig, it used to be a 70-mile round trip, and now it's just 6 miles. And they built that in 60 years ago.
But they didn't bring
any electricity. No.
Right.
No. Living off grid, if you're trying to do it properly with a good quality supply, it's expensive and it takes a lot of looking after, and there's a fair bit of anxiety, certainly on my part.
And what would you say then about the situation of being off grid? In what we laughingly think is modern Scotland, we've got you off the grid completely. We've got businesses that can't site on Applecross because it can't get phase 3 really powerful energy. We've got a hydro owned by the community that can only put half of its energy into the grid. And we've got another hydro that was built that is only able to export a 40th of its capacity. And nobody seems to care.
That's right. It does seem to be, surely you've got enough. There are much further arguments into it as well. Not just that we can generate here. Certainly everybody here is using whatever renewables they can, whether it's solar or wind or water. They're doing it in a microscale for their own properties. And so if we were connected to the grid, we'd keep those because they make your energy cheaper. We wouldn't be buying it, but we'd still have that convenience of being connected to the grid.
Do you think people just think you're out of sight, out of mind?
I think that's much of it is that. I think a lot of it is perhaps focus on the big stuff rather than the smaller stuff. And the smaller stuff isn't necessarily hard to do or more expensive in any way. I think it's just too little things, just lots of little things that would require a bit of more manpower to do instead of a big connector that might take a team a few months or years to plan.
That's what you call making a virtue of necessity. So is this. Bakkafrost is a Faroese fish farm producer based at Kishorn, beside the fabrication yard, which unbelievably was also off-grid in its heyday, winning orders for rig construction whilst using giant generators. Today, Bakkafrost needs energy it also can't get from the grid. So, another hydro with energy lost in space, like the community dam, has come to the rescue.
These dams, a little series of them here, Altnamoyne, are privately owned and were built some years ago with the expectation that the power could be horsed out in an improved grid. Actually, a lot of that energy has been somewhat frozen in time until very recently.
Roy and Martin Foster, two brothers, have spent a decade trying to get their Altnamoyne hydro connected to the grid. They were promised an upgrade by 2019. SSE say they did apply eventually for that in 2022, and are now waiting for planning approval from the Scottish Government, and they say no comment on a live application. But necessity is the mother of invention. So the brothers are connecting their stranded hydro energy to Bakkafrost via a £3 million cable over the hills. Recently, they did pay SSE for a grid upgrade at huge expense. So finally, they are exporting 2 megawatts. But that improved grid still doesn't reach Applecross. It's crazy, expensive, unnecessary and exhausting. When hydro was born in the 1940s, it was all going to be so different. Tom Johnson banged landowners' heads together in the wartime years as Scottish Secretary to build hydro dams across the Highlands, bringing power to the glens. I know because my mother's family in Caithness went from using tilly lamps to electricity in the 1950s, and that hydro company had a social remit. All of that went out the window in the 1980s with Thatcher's privatisation of energy. Now, no one in Scotland expects what every other small country at our latitude expects and enjoys: cheap, renewable energy, owned and managed generally by local councils, with grid improvements planned and funded by the state, not a private company. So Scotland doesn't need to be struggling. The examples of better energy and better living are all around.
Well, there's one thing that's obvious here, and it is how incredibly self-reliant people in Applecross have had to be. I mean, we see Nigel there, who's managed to produce a whole house that's off-grid, between 2 grids, in fact, but he has to have a standby generator because he's guessing how much he and his guests might need to use. It's always a little bit stressful. There's that big stress because big business can't really come to this peninsula. It needs phase 3 energy, which is a more intense kind of power, and that's not available anywhere on this peninsula. It's the reason that the Applecross distillery isn't on Applecross. And then when you look at the famous Applecross Inn, there aren't electric showers in every room because there's not enough electricity. There's not enough of that powerful phase 3. So there's showers in every room, but they're just not the usual electric. When you think about the people, they are having to rely sometimes on wood, sometimes coal. And of course, some people choose that kind of life. But it's as well you're self-reliant here because you're not going to get much help from the grid. And when it comes to that, 7 in 10 people in a recent survey that responded, 7 in 10 are living in fuel poverty here. That's spending 1/10 of your income or more on heating. And they're surrounded by the potential for hydropower. There's also the question of how future-proof this community is at the moment, because, for example, you can't have any public electric vehicle charging points. Now, that must come as a bit of a shock to people who manage to get over that Bialach and then get here and realise they can't manage to fuel up again if they've got electric vehicles. And we've got governments who have got targets for phasing out everything but electric vehicles. How will that work here if they haven't got a better electricity supply? And when it comes generally to the community, the housing that is so vital for this area, that new housing block can't be built until the new improved grid comes in. The final real kicker here is the community company is amazing. We've seen all the different things that would be taken for granted everywhere else, which are actually provided by that little trust, that development trust. And if income comes to it, it stays here. It pump primes. It creates infrastructure. It makes up for all that the state, the council, and everybody else is not providing here. And it can't even get a second turbine into a tiny project. It can't even export all the energy from its tiny hydro because of that constrained, inadequate grid. So this is what it's like living with an inadequate supply because the infrastructure just hasn't been improved to you. And Applecross is not alone. Like Scotland in many ways, it has energy without power. So can you imagine if this peninsula was covered in lots of little hydro dams with the power available for the local people here and making their bills next to nothing, the cheapest in Europe? It's possible. Why wouldn't you want to come and live and work in Applecross?